My Lords, I regret I wasn't able to speak to this bill at second reading, but I'm taking great delight in speaking to it this evening. I rise to speak to Amendments 22, 23, 107, 138, and then the clauses 15 and 111. I'm well aware that this bill is extremely important. The digital age brings all sorts of opportunities for us, but also lots of challenges, and it's absolutely right to keep up to date and to make sure that we do have legislation in place for the big questions of privacy in such rapidly changing times. When the existing data protection legislation came in, most people were still getting to grips with email, and sending a text message on a mobile phone was a really fancy way of communicating. So it really is time that this legislation is updated. The sheer volume and depth of personal data that's now floating around online would have been unimaginable if you think about we share the deepest and most personal details of ourselves quite freely these days, or some of us do. This bill seeks to set important new standards for the protection of people's data and gives people more rights over how their data is used. So far, so good. For example, it would allow some of us to actually ask the social media companies to delete any stupid comments we made, a decade or so ago, and that might help some MPs at the current time. My problem with this bill is twofold. Large parts of it aren't about protecting people's data, nor granting people new rights. Significant parts of the bill are actually focused on removing or reducing people's data rights, which are otherwise granted by the General Data Protection Regulation. Lord Stevenson used the word aggressive, and I think that's a very good word to use for some of these clauses. The government's trying to exercise too many derogations in this bill, too many opt-outs. We should be aiming to protect people's data as much as possible and only restricting data rights where absolutely necessary. And this is the purpose of the amendments that I've signed or put. The second problem I have is that this is such a power grab by the government. We're going to hear a lot about this, I think, over the next few weeks and months. The bypassing of Parliament like this by giving excessive delegated powers to ministers is, I think, unacceptable. Henry VIII's powers, I can see the very occasional, possibly the very occasional use for them, but overall there's far too much power put into them. The Select Committee put it much better than I can, so I'll quote them. We draw attention to the number and breadth of the designated powers in this bill. This is an increasingly common feature of legislation which, as we have repeatedly stated, causes considerable concern. The government's desire to future-proof legislation, both in light of Brexit and the rapidly changing nature of digital technologies, must be balanced against the need for Parliament to scrutinise and, where necessary, constrain executive powers. And so I think that the privacy rights at stake in this bill are so important that they absolutely must be properly approved by Parliament, parliamentarians. Changing these rights with delegated legislation is a nonsense. It's particularly important that Parliament remains responsible for deciding these rights, since so much of it applies to the government's use of personal data. We can't allow the government to decide what the government is allowed to do. That's absolutely not a democracy, that's a dictatorship. In Clause 9(6), Amendment 22, Article 9 of the GDPR has strict rules about processing particularly sensitive personal data, such as data revealing racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, or trade union membership, and processing of genetic data, biometric data for the purposes of uniquely identifying a natural person, data concerning health, or data concerning a natural person's sex life or sexual orientation. Processing that sensitive data is prohibited, except in a very limited set of circumstances set out in the GDPR or in legislation passed by Parliament. Schedule 1 of this bill sets out 28 circumstances where the sensitive data is allowed to be processed with relevant safeguards, supposedly. And so Clause 9, Part 6 is the Henry VIII power which allows the Secretary of State Just too much power to add, vary or omit conditions and safeguards and make consequential amendments to the section. The committee also concludes that Clause 9, Part 6 is inappropriately wide and should be removed from the bill. I very much hope this is something, we all understand that there will be negotiations on this bill, that it's important to get it passed, but also important that it is passed right. And I very much hope this is one area where the government will see sense and take out these wide-sweeping powers. Personally, I think that we must resist, with everything we have, any attempt by the government to wrestle power over which of these rights is protected and which isn't. Clause 9, Part 7, that's a tidying up provision. If Clause 9.6 is removed, then Clause 9.7 has nothing to apply to, so it should also be removed. Clause 15, I've signed Amendment 107, I should have signed 108 as well. The super-affirmative resolution procedure is much better than the affirmative resolution procedure. It forces the government to have regard to the opinion of Parliament, but it's still far from perfect, and so I think we'd be much better off not having these broad delegated powers in the first place. Clause 33, Amendment 130, this is about removing power to amend Schedule 8 using delegated legislation. This is the same as Clause 9, and of course the same for Clause 84. And on Clause 101, this would remove the power to make further exemptions in relation to national security. I'm going to look forward to seeing this bill become something that we can all perhaps sign up to. But at the moment, I think the government is being far too aggressive, far too greedy for power, and I beg to move.